get everyone transferred across from the other Zoom accounts that we had open for the parallel sessions. But I think we're all, or most of us, are back now. So thanks for getting back so quickly. Hope you've all had very stimulating discussions in the panel sessions. We're now in the final session of today's event on Scotland's response to the climate emergency. And we're delighted to be joined on this closing panel by Claudia Beamish MSP, who is Scottish Labour MSP for the South of Scotland and a member of the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee at Holyrood, by Richard Hardy, the National Secretary of Prospect Scotland and Ireland, the Union Prospect, and a member of the Just Transition, so Just Transition Commissioner, and also by Mike Danson, who is also a Just Transition Commissioner and Professor of Enterprise Policy at Heriot-Watt University. So each of our panelists attended different sectoral breakout sessions this morning. So we're going to start by inviting our panelists to reflect on what they've heard in the sessions that they attended and any key points in particular that they want to highlight in terms of what the Just Transition Commission and the Scottish Government need to take on board in terms of what we've discussed at this event today. So we've got approximately 40 minutes for this session. So we're going to ask our panelists to speak for about 8 minutes, if that's okay, and hopefully leave some time for questions from the floor. So because we're really quite a big group, what we're going to do is manage questions through the chat box. So if you've got a burning question, clarification, whatever, pop it in the chat box as we go along. And Ryan and I will gather the questions from the chat box and then group them in a way that makes sense and ask the panel to respond to them in sort of 2s and 3s, depending on how much time we end up having at the end. Okay, so I'm going to ask our panelists to speak in the order of which we had organised the outbreak panels. So we'll go from Richard, who attended the electricity and energy sessions and the transport session. Then we'll move to Claudia, who attended the buildings session and also the land, agriculture and marine session. And then we'll move to Mike, who attended the waste and circular economy session and the industry session. And I would just ask panelists to say a few words of introduction about yourselves and then move on to broader reflections from today's sessions.
Okay, so that's me up first. Thank you very much. Thanks to Friends of the Earth Scotland for inviting the Just Transition Commission to come along and take part in your event. So a little bit about my day job. I'm the senior officer of the Union Prospect in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. And you'll be, I'm sure, delighted to find out that Prospect organises in aviation and in the offshore industry and in the energy sector and in the creative industries and in government and just about every sector that you can think of. In fact, we have a slogan that says, you're probably never more than about 200 feet from a Prospect member when you're going about your daily life. So I was one of the trade union representatives asked to take part as a Just Transition Commissioner. My other trade union colleague is Dave Moxham, who's the Assistant General Secretary of the STUC. I listened to the debates with real interest, and the data and the level of contributions was fantastic. I think as a trade unionist, trying to navigate the waters of Just Transition, for me, it's really, really, really important that we have the levers in government, whether that's devolved or reserved, to enable us to get to where we want to be. And one of the questions that came up in the energy sector, in the energy session, was about direct action and about how we can undertake change without alienating workers. And I think this is an absolutely key issue, and one which we reflect on quite a lot in the Just Transition Commission, but also in the wider trade union movement. People have rightly identified that there is a Just Transition Commission in Scotland. There isn't one for the rest of the UK. And I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions as to why that is politically. Prospect is a politically neutral union, so I shouldn't take a political stance. We're also about to create one in Northern Ireland. And if we're going to make a difference, then we have to have people in power that will actually take forward the great ideas and the great thoughts and solutions that people were coming up with. But we can't do that if we don't take workers with us. And part of the conversation we had this morning on the electricity and energy sector one was about this, and about how we don't alienate people in the oil and gas industry, or in the to be fair, the electricity generation sector has largely gone through a process of change. In Scotland, there are only a few thermal generator plants left after Long Annick closed in 2016. So we can, we are looking at the impacts around oil and gas, and we're more engaged, I think, as a union than some other of our colleagues, and it is a challenge to take blue collar unions with us on this journey, because what they're seeing is jobs going and no new jobs coming. And Benny was right in his opening remarks to raise the issue, which has become something of a totem in Scotland, about BIFAB. Now, I live just down the road from BIFAB in Fife. There are 2 yards in Fife. There's 1 yard up in Lewis. And the green jobs revolution that we hear about a lot just isn't happening for workers. And we can't put the cart before the horse. If you don't take people with you and don't explain how you'll take people with you, then you will not get the levers of power to enable us to make the change that we absolutely desperately need to make. Because people will vote, even though it's, in the eyes of many of the people who are on this call, against their own best interests. They will vote for the status quo. They won't vote for change because they don't know what change looks like. And people don't like change. They're nervous of it, they're concerned about it, and they're particularly nervous and concerned about it when it's about their jobs and about where they live, how they bring up their families, how they feed their families, how they put a roof over their heads. So both the STUC and Prospect, we've launched our renewable energy report yesterday, and the STUC will launch one next week. And we're looking for the Scottish Government to play a much bigger role in taking ownership and direction of building a renewable energy sector that creates jobs in Scotland. Because from a just transition position, and I made this point on the breakout room earlier. Everybody had we'll have a just transition in their slides, and that's great, and it's good that we're really thinking about it. But what that looks like and what that means isn't ever really developed. It's kind of like, well, we'll let the trade unions get on and deal with that. I'd love to think that after all of the bonhomie between Johnson and his government down in the UK and the TUC over the COVID issue has worn off, that we'll continue to have a meaningful and open door approach from Westminster to the trade union movement, so that we can get on with building a just transition. Frankly, I think I might be a bit disappointed if I was to take that approach. So we're going to build. We need to build with what we've got. We need to look at how we can encourage the Scottish Government to actually have, and I'm stealing a phrase, living, breathing, just transition that we can point to our members who are concerned about losing their jobs and about what will happen to them in this change. Because until we can do that, and until we have absolute concrete examples of what a just transition looks like I'm assuming that's a cat, is it? I'm not sure. That's we're going to struggle. We're really going to struggle to take people with us. And if we don't take people with us, then we'll never have the levers of power to be able to do what it is that we need to do. So for me, and that's the angle that I try and take on the Just Transition Commission. Some of you will know that we've just published our interim report. We're talking about the need for planning and taking things forward. Mike can deal with the economics of that much better than I can, because that's his area of expertise. But from the trade union movement perspective, and a colleague on the in the room this morning spoke about how we need to encourage those workers that are offshore to and their unions to to be less asking for subsidy and support for an industry. It's really difficult when you're a trade union leader to resist calls from your members to help save their jobs, because at the end of the day, that's why I became a trade unionist. Actually, I come from a pit village in Yorkshire, and somebody used the phrase unjust transition. Well, you can't teach me about what an unjust transition looks like. I lived through it. It ruined the lives of a number of my family and my friends. So I want to make sure that this one is just, and that's what drives me around just transition. But we need to be able, when people say to us, "Yeah, we understand it. You don't want the government to be supporting Total or Shell, but those are the jobs that pay mortgage, the job that put food on my kids' tables. And where do I go and get a job if not?" Because for all the talk about the green recovery and the green regeneration, it's not creating jobs in Scotland. The Sea Green announcement last week, the turbines will be built in the Isle of Wight. Well, at least that's in the UK, but there will be 50 jobs maybe in Scotland as a result of £5 billion worth of investment. And that has to change, because until that changes and we can create a manufacturing base that we can point our members at, we will struggle to deliver what we need to do. We need to have people who think like Claudia in power in Westminster. I'm not going to make a point about Scotland because that's a dangerous area for me to trespass on given my job. But we need people who think like us in positions of power. And we don't do that by alienating the people that put a tick in the box. So one thing I'd ask as a Just Transition Commissioner and as a trade unionist is you think about how what we ask for is perceived by those people who are going to give us the ability to deliver that. Then that's the voters and the workers who are impacted by change. I will be brief, and Mike said I needed to play nicely on this one. I do have a bit of a concern about the fixation that some parts of the climate change movement have on cycling, because for me, it doesn't address issues relating to the socio-economic situation in the UK. We don't have people commute. Unlike lots of European cities that I've been to where people live and work in the middle of the cities, the UK is fundamentally different to that. And I don't think we've got time at the moment to rip all of that down and start all over again. And I think cycling can be a little bit of a deflection from what we need to do, which is look at electrification of rail, putting more stuff back onto rail. And I absolutely agree with a colleague from Getting Glasgow Moving around the requirement to get things back into public ownership, because with public ownership comes actual public service as opposed to public profit. So I think that's probably about 8 minutes. I wasn't timing myself, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Richard. And lots of comments and some questions coming in there as you were speaking. So hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to some of those at the end. Over to Claudia now. Claudia.
Great. Thanks very much, Mary. And I too, like Richard, wanted to start with thanking all the organisations for all the hard work that has been put into the inspiring event that we've all shared together. Stop Climate Chaos and Environment Link and yourselves at Friends of the Earth. I think I do want to identify myself very strongly with the words of Richard, and just start by highlighting in the interim report of the Just Transition Commission, and I'll just read two of the top recommendations that came from that. Ensure fair work is promoted across all climate change programs receiving public money, and I would add all sectors and all and for all workers and affected communities. But I know that that is part of the ethos of the Just Transition Commission. And perhaps the one I think is most important myself, and this is a personal observation, develop a climate emergency skills action plan, which the Scottish Government's committed to, because if there isn't a just way forward for workers, whether they're oil workers or farmers or wherever they work, and the communities that depend on their salaries, then it's just not going to happen, like Richard's saying. And I suppose in terms of just transition, it is really important, I think, to recognise the work of the Just Transition Partnership today. And I don't know if that's come up in any of the workshops, Mary, but that was certainly when I really first saw unions, NGOs, communities working together as a really powerful force for change. And we're all afraid of change, especially if it's going to impact us individually or our communities. I saw that happening, and they gave Scottish Labour, which happens to be my party, but also other parties, support in forging the amendments to our Climate Change Act and getting the Just Transition principles into that act. In my very strongly held view, that's not enough. I think we need a long-term, statutory, well-funded just transition for the duration of net zero that will take us forward, right the way through what you were highlighting at the beginning, Mary, the importance of the rapid transformational change up to 2030, where we now have more robust targets, which all the parties, political parties in the end coalesced around. It happened to be my amendment, but I just picked something in the middle and we got there between the different parties. But I think it is really fundamentally important that we build on this together, and I have written recently to Rosanna Cunningham as the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change to say that I'm absolutely clear, as are so many others, that we need, coming out of COVID and going forward to the transition, to have a Just Transition Commission that continues to build on the really, really substantial and broad-ranging work that has been done already. So I just wanted to make that point. And beyond that, I completely understand what Richard's saying about working people and the need to take everybody with us. There are, of course, as we've heard in all the workshops this morning, multi-benefits of the different way of the new pathways that we're all creating together. And those particularly, I think, for me, came out in the first panel that I attended, which was on buildings and homes particularly, and the benefits that people who are vulnerable and people who are on low incomes will get from a really robust way forward for our heat networks and our heating of our homes and our insulation of our homes, and how that will tackle fuel poverty, which is really one of the most shameful things about policy in Scotland. I'm clear at the moment, and I'm sure people will agree with me. You know, it is a UN right to a home, and here that means a warm home, not a leaky home, as Elizabeth Leighton was saying from the Existing Homes Alliance, who was one of our speakers this morning. And I think in terms of what was being said in that workshop, the question was asked, a rhetorical question, which was actually answered. What is the problem? You know, in relation to fuel poverty, and so many people living in fuel poverty here in Scotland at the moment. And there are structures, there is regulation which needs to be more robust and all that, but it just isn't enough. And as was said in that workshop, and everybody will be able to watch and listen to it afterwards, we need to double the programs. And that will bring work for people in communities across Scotland if there's proper training. And we can't go on having a situation where buildings, our homes, are leaking and creating so many of the emissions, and we're using the wrong fuels. But I think the contributions by all the speakers in that workshop will give you some really clear ideas of the way that we can all work to encourage government to really be more robust about heat networks and heat pumps, which hopefully will be built in Scotland, and all those systems, so that we make sure that. But we must make sure, as they were saying in that workshop, all the speakers, that that it doesn't impact wrongly on those who can't afford to foot the bill. So I want to say something briefly as well about the agriculture and land use and marine section. Again, people can see that afterwards, and I would really encourage you to look at that. Agriculture, second largest emitter, and Andrew Midgley of the RSPB gave us a clear presentation of how low the ambition is in the climate change plan, only 9% change, and that's just not acceptable. And it's about changing markets, he stressed, and possibly different skills and land use. And let's remember that the average position on farms is that they're losing money, that 7,400 by £704,000 is the average, and that it's about changing policy to public goods and supporting farmers in that, and that again is a just transition. And he also highlighted the importance of deer management and also of natural regeneration and agroforestry. I wanted to highlight how important the regional land use strategy is, which is now in law in the Climate Change Act. And also we've highlighted driven grouse moors and how these should be licensed properly, and looking at the burning of deep peat. And then we had a really interesting exploration of affordability of food and a national food strategy from Nourish, and who highlighted again the multi-benefits of creating a food policy for Scotland and enshrining a food strategy in our law. And then we heard from Callum Duncan on marine issues and just transition, and how we're failing in so many ways on blue carbon, which involves seagrass and sediments, and we need to put more money into that, and how the MPAs aren't necessarily managed as well as they could be. We need sustainable inshore fisheries with the grain of ecosystems, and the integration of marine management with marine planning. And he highlighted we need to stop the heavy fisheries in our inshore waters. So I just wanted to very quickly say that I want to recognise as well the demand to the First Minister by 80 civic society organisations and unions and churches and NGOs for radical recovery as we come out of the virus that delivers a fairer and greener Scotland. And I also wanted to highlight the importance of us all, I happen to be an MSP, but approaching politicians, and how effective that is in getting these issues higher up on the agenda, so that when we come to things like the National Planning Framework, where there's going to be a commitment not to frack in Scotland, for instance, which Friends of the Earth's done so much work on, or where we come to the updated climate change plan, it really does matter what voters say and what, this is long-term stuff, of course, about all our survival, people and planet, but it really matters what people say. And so do feed in. And finally, I just want to encourage you actually to submit to the Just Transition Commission, and that it's possible to to approach them. You can see it online, and I'm sure that either Mike or Richard will tell you about how to do that in the chat, and actually put in your views to that as well, because all this will go back to government and show that the just transition is the only fair way, if we get it right, if we get that process right, to get us to net zero in a way that will bring prosperity to the whole of Scotland and also recognise the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global South as we do it. So thank you very much for this morning. I've learned a lot. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claudia. That's great to have you with us this morning, with a view to all the work that you're going to be doing on the committee, right, as we develop the revised climate change plan towards the end of this year. Okay, so we're running close to out of time, but I'm going to hand over to Mike Danson now for some reflections, and then I hope we'll squeeze in just a bit of time to come back to some final last comments from panelists, hopefully reflecting on some of the great comments and questions that have been coming in on the chat. So Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the contributions. Who am I? I was invited onto the Just Transition Commission as a Professor of Economics, so it's to bring certain skills. I'm also chair of Citizens Basic Income Scotland and co-convener of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, etc., etc. Just to reiterate, as Claudia's just said, the Commission really welcomes submissions from people. Go online, just put Just Transition Commission into Google or whatever, and you'll see how to submit evidence, opinions, and so forth. It's absolutely vital, as came out from a number of the speakers this morning. One of the first things that was said was we need to move as a society away from the ownership of things to buying services, which sounds simple, has good outcomes to it, but it means major changes in behaviour. And that change in behaviour runs through an awful lot of things, whether we're as consumers, producers, workers, government, or whatever. Change in behaviour is very difficult. First of all, you have to change attitudes as well. Although I think during this COVID crisis, we've seen the behaviour of the vast majority of Scots, people living in Scotland, change quite markedly over a very short time and against what many of the experts thought would happen. The next meeting of the Commission is going to be around skills and training and retraining, and that was brought up over and over again during each of the presentations we heard. And that requires resources to go into reskilling people, retraining them, and it's everybody from designers and architects through to traditional trades. Craig DL said in one of the sessions, you know, we need more plumbers and electricians and so forth, maybe at a European level for refitting homes and so forth. But it struck us when we went to Aberdeen, where we met some people involved in combined heating and power district schemes there, that architects, designers just didn't want to know, didn't want to connect new buildings right across the road from the generators, which really raises questions about the skills they have, their views and opinions on the world and so on, and about the training they're getting. It came through quite forcibly that from, if we look at what's called the waste resources hierarchy, that moving up that chain, looking to manage resources rather than managing waste, would create a lot more high quality good jobs. But how can the market deliver that? Well, no, that needs government intervention in various ways. So how do we put either more public ownership, more public controls, regulation of waste? How do we get materials and products, commodities to be reused, recycled, refused, right at the top there? If we don't have the levers of power for that, can we put taxes on and other regulations to reduce waste, etc.? So, and again, that involves major changes in the economy and in markets. And in that and in many other areas, we just don't have the powers in Scotland. Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament doesn't have the ability often to intervene. When we're talking about the oil and gas sector, when we as Just Transition Commissioners went to meet the trade unions, there was a lot of scepticism, cynicism, as Richard's already said, about a just transition. And then when you delve into that and talk to the trade union members and leaders, they say, well, there's all these different regulatory bodies for offshore workers. And the health and safety checks and training we do in oil and gas is not transferable into renewables, into offshore wind and so on. So there's major problems between the regulatory bodies and trying to get pressure put upon through government onto regulatory bodies to get them to speak to each other and so on. There are major barriers, therefore, to moving to a just transition. And if the workers can see those barriers, they're going to be very sceptical and cynical about that. And in some ways, how do you overcome those? Craig DL we said, well, let's go with 4 principles. A just transition must have participation. There must be transparency around policies and strategies at the firm level, never mind government level, and local and central government and so on. We need opportunities for all. We need decentralisation and bottom up. And that fits very well with the idea of circular economies, foundational economies, resilient economies, and so on. However, when we heard from the people from Mossmoran, their experiences were very different. Things were happening that literally went over their heads, went through their bodies, gave them ill health, their well-being was badly affected. What were the elected politicians doing? Many of them were incorporated by the big multinationals. So how do we break into that? And again, some of the legislative powers are not devolved to Scotland, therefore having to work through the UK government, which is often even less likely to listen to workers and communities and consumers than locally. And what came out from Mossmoran, there was no forum where local people could raise their concerns with SEPA, with government agencies, with politicians, never mind with the companies. And therefore they had to do it themselves and try and get together and bring in other forces and support. That's building from the bottom up, but it shouldn't be that way. A motion to Fife Council, which is now putting pressure on the Scottish Government to start addressing that problem, that lack of transparency, lack of participation, and so on. And one of the reasons, there are many reasons why GDP is a measure of our economy and well-being, why many reasons why it doesn't work. One in particular, for small open economies like Scotland, is GDP is a very poor measure of the benefits to the economy as a whole. Because a lot of the benefits, i.e. the profits of Mossmoran, Grangemouth, etc., go out of Scotland. They don't come to us at all. And yet they seem to contribute to GDP. And therefore, for a lot of our politicians, they look at the highlights, how many jobs there's going to be, contribution to GDP, and that contribution does no benefit to us within the country unless you happen to own shares in those big multinationals. Having said all that, as Claudia said earlier, we as a Just Transition Commission, we're being encouraged to speak to the economic recovery and renewal, the sustainable renewal commissions and advisory groups, and so forth. And we're seeing a whole series of advisory groups, commissions set up by the government, but also agencies outside, the Wellbeing Alliance, Commonweal, and so on, who have a very similar consensus developing around the idea of a genuine green recovery, which can be just, should be just, and therefore that there is some optimism if we all collectively, 150 of us and the organisations we represent and these commissions, push in the same direction, then pressure can be put upon those above us to create an economy and society that is participative, transparent, opportunities for all. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Great. So we are nearly running out of time. We've had an awful lot of comments, actually, mostly comments rather than questions in the chat. We don't have time to address them all, is the reality, in the sort of 4 or 5 minutes that we've got left. But there are two key themes that seem to be emerging from the sort of combination of questions and comments. And one of those is around the risks of over-reliance on carbon capture and storage as a means of meeting our climate targets, right? And the other one is around sort of how in ensuring that the planning for short to medium term recovery from COVID, we put considerations of climate emergency and just transition at the core of that. So how do we avoid going for quick fix short-term solutions that only dig us deeper into the multiple interlinked crises of climate, biodiversity, social injustice at the domestic and global levels. So what I would like to do is invite the panel again, just to briefly, maybe 1 minute each, closing comments, and ideally reflecting on one or both of those themes when you do, or if there's something else that's come through in the comments that's grabbed your attention that you really want to respond to, please feel free to take the opportunity now to do that. So I think we'll go in the same order again, and just if we can keep it really brief, one or 2 minutes maximum. So over to Richard.
Thanks. Oh, a trade union has been restricted to 2 minutes. Right, I'll be as quick as I can. A couple of people raised in the comments, and I've been trying to answer people who raised specific issues from my bit by responding privately in the chat. In relation to the carbon capture and the role on the JTC, we're not discussing specific technologies on the JTC. We are trying to take a holistic view, and if you look at the interim report, we're not saying, we're not going to be, well, I'm fairly certain that we're not going to be banging a report on Rosanna Cunningham's desk which says put all your money in carbon capture and storage, because I think that's not what the Just Transition Commission was set up to do. I would ask people that are critical of carbon capture and storage to have a think about how we address high carbon emitting firms that bring in all of the money that we'll need to pay for public ownership of things if we don't use carbon capture and storage. My union has a long-standing policy in support of that. So, but the fact that my union supports carbon capture and storage, and there are people that work for carbon capture and storage businesses on the JTC, shouldn't be taken as an indication that we're about to come out and say, yeah, that's the way forward and you should just do this and that'll solve all of the problems, because to be blunt, it won't solve all of the problems. I think if I go right back to the very start, when Ryan introduced the day at 9 o'clock, 9:30, he talked about the fact that as a commission, we probably hadn't had a formal day with environmental colleagues, and we have done some work with the trade union movement. STUC actually set up our own energy conference to enable us to interact with the commission. You can rest assured that Mike and I will take back the views and the information that we've done. We'll also raise with Jim and who's the chair, and other commissioners about whether that is something that we need to do to be seen to be not to be seen to be, but to come and talk as a commission to you. We did hold, we were going to have an event like this in person at Dynamic Earth, but it ended up being a digital one. I don't know how many people that are on this call were able to join that call, but make sure you put that in your submission to the commission. So a number of people have been saying, make sure you get a submission in. Absolutely. We need to hear from as many people as possible. Our ability to go out and talk to people, which particularly I've been really keen to do, not just to be seen to be Edinburgh centric and talking on behalf of Edinburgh or talking on behalf of the Central Belt. It's been curtailed because of the situation we find ourselves in. So we need you to come to us and leave us your submissions. And if you want us to try and get something up and running that looks a bit like this, but maybe on, maybe with more commissioners, and some of the Secretariat, please put that in your submission too, and we will we'll make sure that gets discussed. So I hope that wasn't any more than 2 minutes. So.
Great, thank you, Richard. Okay, Claudia, 1 or 2 minutes.
I'll make it 1. Great. Quickly on carbon capture and storage, I do think the jury's still out on it, but if we don't do that, we really have to look very seriously at what the alternatives are and how we go forward together. I wanted to highlight something I didn't highlight before, which has been touched on by Mike and others. I do think public ownership is a really important aspect of all this, and the public good as the grounding for a just transition. And looking at municipal and cooperative and community ownership, land reform came up earlier in the agriculture and land use one, but it's an urban and a rural issue as well. Where does the power lie? And I think it is fundamentally important for just transition in terms of confidence building that we show where things are working, whether it's a manufacturer like Star Renewables, or whether it's an area-based energy efficiency scheme like there is in Ayrshire, in South Scotland, which I represent, which is for everybody, and particularly supports vulnerable households and households on low incomes. I think we have to show where things work and show it better and faster if we're going to take people with us. So I think that's my final comment, except to say thanks. You know, it's been really, really great as a politician who has to go back and try and get all this in some sort of order. But please just do what you can, everybody, because we're all in this together. People and planet. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudia. Mike.
Yeah, but very briefly, we did raise with the BBC. They misrepresented our collective views on public ownership last week on the Commission, and we haven't ruled anything or anything out. But as Richard said, we're not going into very great detail on individual projects, proposals, and so on. As I said earlier, that there are a whole series of advisory groups and commissions and so on sitting at the moment. We're interacting, interrelating, and that seems to be the right way, because different interests across from health and well-being, the economy, housing, fuel poverty, etc., really need to be represented separately and then brought together, and then see how we can move forward. Again, just reiterate the interim report. When we put it out, there was a press launch. There was quite a lot of information. It did say get involved. A number of people have contacted me over the month saying, "Can you raise this?" I said, "Well, no, you raise it. Do a submission. It's online. Get it in there, and we will read it and incorporate it, and so forth." And going back to those 4 sort of principles from Commonweal, participation. You need to participate. Come and talk to us. As Richard said, we've taken part in a number of these sort of sessions. We're more than happy to do that, because it's about the dialogue. It's about hearing from everybody and empowering everybody. And I think that's the way forward, because that's totally consistent with a just transition. It has to be participative, democratic, transparent, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for keeping your closing comments there brief. So it's really time to close, but I just before doing so, I'd like to take the opportunity to flag that the new climate change legislation, right, that we passed through Parliament last year includes a number of really important provisions in terms of just transition. So these are provisions that were championed by Claudia in the Scottish Parliament that require ministers to take account of just transition principles in preparing future climate change plans, right? So future climate change plans must set out how proposals and policies will affect different sectors of the economy, different regions, and set out how the workforce, employers, and communities will be supported in the transition. So obviously, all really good stuff in there that we in Friends of the Earth Scotland and many of us in the environment sector fought to get into that legislation. But ministers have stated that the work to revise the current climate change plan in light of the new targets will actually be done under the old legislation. meaning that they do not have to have regard to these principles in the version of the plan that they are working on and developing this year. So as you might guess, we think this is absolutely the wrong decision, and even more so in the light of the need for the just and green recovery from COVID, right? And the really urgent need to create decent green jobs as part of that in the very short term. And so I want to take this opportunity to urge the commissioners here this morning to take that up with the minister and ask that they do take these principles into account in this revised version of the climate change plan. So I'll close now and thank all of our panelists. So there's too many to name. There are so many panelists across the 6 parallel sessions, and our panelists in this closing session just now. But thank you all very much for the time and effort to participate in this event. Thanks for the commissioners and MSPs and everyone else who attended the event and contributed such thought-provoking questions and comments as part of this discussion. And thanks very much to the team at Friends of the Earth Scotland for doing such a great job of organising and facilitating and tech support in the background. There's a whole sort of mini army of people sort of behind the scenes making sure that everything runs smoothly. And just to remind everyone, it's great this has been flagged several times, but to remind everyone that the Just Transition Commission's call for evidence closes at the end of the month, so get your comments into that. We have recorded this event. We're going to send it out to you. Those of you who registered for the event, we'll send you an email with the recording and with the links to help you to respond to the Just Transition Commission's call for evidence. So keep your eyes open for that. And otherwise, probably time for most of you to go and have your lunch and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again very, very much. Bye.